The cleaning lady left a message in my room. Act like you can't read Russian. I found the note tucked inside my clean towels when I returned from the conference sessions. My hands shook as I read the message scrawled in careful English handwriting. Act like you can't read Russian. For 3 days, I'd been attending the International Energy Summit at the Metropole Moscow, sitting through presentations about pipeline infrastructure and natural gas distribution networks across Eastern Europe. The cleaning lady had been servicing my room every morning while I attended breakfast meetings, always offering a polite smile and nod when we passed in the marble-lined corridors. Now she was warning me about something that made my blood run cold. I stood there holding the towels, trying to process what this cryptic message meant and why someone would risk leaving it for me. That evening, I sat at the hotel bar, pretending to review technical specifications while actually studying the other conference delegates. Viktor Petrov from the Russian Energy Ministry kept glancing in my direction between conversations with his colleagues. Too often, too deliberately. When he switched to rapid Russian with the man beside him, I forced my expression to remain blank and uninterested, even as they discussed my persistent questions about the Yamal Peninsula infrastructure and unusual interest in strategic pipeline locations. Their words hit me like ice water as I sat there nursing my drink. They suspected I was gathering intelligence for the CIA, that my engineering credentials were just cover for espionage operations. The conversation continued with increasing certainty about my supposed intelligence activities. The absurdity would have been laughable under different circumstances. I was David Kellerman, a petroleum systems engineer from Houston, representing Apex Energy Solutions in routine investment discussions. My company had sent me to Moscow to evaluate potential partnerships for liquefied natural gas distribution. Nothing more sinister than standard business development. Every question I'd asked during the technical sessions had been standard due diligence, the kind of infrastructure analysis any competent engineer would conduct before recommending a multi-billion-dollar investment to his board of directors. But apparently, my thoroughness had triggered suspicions among people who saw American spies lurking behind every legitimate business inquiry. The paranoia of the current political climate had transformed routine professional diligence into evidence of espionage. I nursed my vodka and pretended to scroll through emails while Petrov and his associate continued their conversation in Russian, their voices carrying across the elegant bar. The ministry official's tone carried a certainty that chilled me to my core. He was convinced I was operating under corporate cover, using my engineering credentials to gather classified information about Russia's energy infrastructure and strategic capabilities. Tomorrow, he intended to have me detained for questioning by state security services. Tonight, they planned to search my room while I slept, looking for evidence of espionage activities that would justify my arrest and detention. The cleaning lady had somehow overheard their plans and risked her own safety to warn me about what was coming. Her courage in leaving that note had probably saved my life. Back in room 847, I paced the Persian carpet trying to process the situation and figure out what to do next. My laptop contained nothing more incriminating than technical presentations and industry analysis reports, the standard materials any engineer would collect. My phone held conference contacts and photos of pipeline schematics that had been openly distributed during the summit sessions as part of the official materials. But I understood how innocent materials could be twisted into evidence of espionage by people determined to find conspiracy where none existed. How legitimate business documents could be reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion. In Putin's Russia, American businessmen had been detained on fabricated charges before, held for months, while diplomats negotiated their release through back channels and quiet diplomatic pressure that took forever to yield results. I pulled out my secure satellite phone and called my handler at Apex Energy headquarters in Houston. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using encrypted communication to report that I wasn't actually a spy, that my engineering work was exactly what it appeared to be. James Wright answered on the second ring, his Houston drawl immediately familiar and reassuring across the international connection that crackled with distance. I explained the situation in careful terms, aware that even encrypted calls might be monitored by Russian intelligence services with sophisticated interception capabilities. Wright's response was immediate and unambiguous, delivered in the clipped tones of someone making a life-or-death decision. Abort the mission. Get to the embassy. Prepare for emergency extraction. The company would handle everything else, but I needed to get to safety immediately before the situation deteriorated further. But the American embassy was 40 minutes across Moscow traffic, and I had no guarantee of safe passage through a city where the local authorities suspected me of espionage and might already be watching my movements. The cleaning lady's warning suggested they were moving tonight, which meant I had perhaps hours before Russian security services came knocking on my door with arrest warrants. I needed to disappear from this hotel without triggering a manhunt that would turn my business trip into an international incident and make headlines around the world. The question was how to vanish from a luxury hotel in central Moscow without leaving a trail that would lead investigators directly to the American embassy, the most obvious destination for someone in my situation. Every decision I made now could mean the difference between freedom and years in a Russian prison. I gathered my essential documents and a single change of clothes, leaving everything else untouched to maintain the appearance of a guest planning to return after a brief absence. The technical manuals and conference materials remained spread across the desk, as if I were still reviewing them and planning to continue my work. I powered down my laptop, but left it connected to the charger, creating the illusion that I intended to continue working later in the evening. Every detail had to suggest a temporary absence rather than permanent departure, a brief step out rather than a desperate escape. If they suspected I'd fled, they would mobilize resources to prevent me from leaving the country, closing airports and train stations and border crossings. The appearance of normalcy was my only protection against immediate pursuit. The cleaning lady appeared in the hallway as I stepped out of my room, her cart positioned strategically between my door and the elevator bank like she'd been waiting for this moment. She was perhaps 60 years old, with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, and intelligent brown eyes that had seen too much history, too many regimes, too many dangers. When she looked at me, I saw recognition and fear in equal measure, an understanding that we were both taking terrible risks. She gestured subtly toward the service elevator at the end of the corridor, then whispered a single word in accented English that changed everything about my understanding of the situation and what was really happening in this hotel. Her voice was barely audible, but the urgency was unmistakable. Galena. That name meant nothing to me, but her expression suggested it should, that this was information I desperately needed to understand. She pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm as she pretended to organize cleaning supplies on her cart, her movements casual and practiced. I opened it carefully, reading her careful English script that had been written with obvious effort and attention to detail. Galina Volkov, room 612. She knows about the missing Americans. Trust her. Tell her Katya sent you. The cleaning lady nodded once, then continued down the hallway with her cart, leaving me standing alone with information that transformed this from a case of mistaken identity into something far more sinister and complex. Missing Americans. The words echoed in my mind with terrible implications. I took the service elevator to the 6th floor, my mind racing through the implications of what I'd just learned about missing Americans and what that might mean. If other business travelers had disappeared from this hotel, then Petrov's suspicions weren't random paranoia, but part of a larger pattern of targeting foreign nationals. Someone was systematically targeting American conference attendees, using espionage accusations to justify detentions that might never become public knowledge or diplomatic incidents. The Russian government could claim these men had been caught spying and simply hold them indefinitely, their companies and families believing they were being held on legitimate security charges while they disappeared into the system. The scale of what I was uncovering made my personal danger seem like just one small piece of a much larger operation. Room 612 was located in the hotel's executive wing, an area reserved for VIP guests and diplomatic personnel with enhanced security and privacy. I knocked softly and waited, aware that approaching the wrong person could expose me to additional danger and compromise whatever help might be available. The woman who opened the door was younger than I'd expected, perhaps 40 years old, with blonde hair and piercing blue eyes that immediately assessed me for threats with professional precision. She wore a simple black dress that could have belonged to a businesswoman or a government official, deliberately anonymous and unremarkable. When I mentioned Katya's name, her entire demeanor shifted from suspicious to urgently protective, and she pulled me inside quickly. "Come in quickly," she said in perfect English, pulling me into the suite and immediately checking the hallway before closing the door with practiced efficiency. "Katya told me you might come tonight. We don't have much time before they begin tonight's operation." She gestured toward a sitting area furnished with expensive leather furniture and a view of Red Square's illuminated spires glowing against the night sky. "I'm Galina Volkov, cultural attaché with the American Embassy. I've been investigating disappearances of American businessmen from this hotel for the past 18 months. The revelation hit me with physical force. She wasn't just a contact who might help me escape. She was actively investigating a systematic pattern of operations against Americans. My situation wasn't unique, but part of something much larger. The revelation about missing businessmen hit me like a physical blow as I processed what she was telling me. 3 other Apex Energy employees had attended conferences at this same hotel over the past year and a half, all returning with positive reports. All had returned home safely, reporting successful meetings and promising opportunities for future partnerships with Russian energy companies. But if Galina was investigating disappearances from this location, then perhaps those men hadn't been as safe as they'd believed during their stays. Perhaps they'd been compromised in ways they never understood, their communications monitored, their activities recorded, their business intelligence extracted through methods that left no visible traces or awareness of compromise. They might have returned home carrying Russian intelligence surveillance without ever knowing they'd been targeted. Galina pulled out a thick folder containing photographs and documents that painted a disturbing picture of systematic espionage operations targeting American energy sector professionals across multiple conferences and events. The hotel served as a perfect collection point, she explained, because it hosted legitimate business conferences while providing Russian intelligence services with controlled access to visiting Americans in a setting that seemed normal and safe. Conference attendees were monitored, their conversations recorded, their communications intercepted through sophisticated technical means. Those who asked the wrong questions or showed too much interest in strategic infrastructure were flagged for special attention and further investigation. The operation had been running for years, with remarkable success, she told me, gathering intelligence that was being compiled into comprehensive profiles. The cleaning staff are all FSB informants, she continued, spreading surveillance photos across the coffee table that showed various people being followed and monitored throughout the hotel. But Katya is different. Her son was killed in Chechnya fighting for Russian forces, but she blames the government for sending boys to die in an unnecessary war. She's been feeding information to American intelligence for 3 years, helping us track Russian operations against American business interests. The photographs showed various hotel guests being followed, their movements tracked, their meetings recorded by surveillance equipment hidden throughout the conference facilities. The technical sophistication was remarkable, with cameras and microphones concealed in ways that would be invisible to ordinary guests. The entire hotel was essentially an intelligence collection facility, disguised as a luxury business venue. Looking at the images spread before me, I recognized several faces from the Energy Summit and social events I'd attended. Men I'd shared drinks with were identified as Russian intelligence operatives working under business cover or false identities. Technical sessions I'd attended had been elaborate information-gathering operations designed to map American energy companies' strategic interests and capabilities. The entire conference was a front, designed to bring American petroleum engineers and executives to Moscow, where they could be systematically exploited for intelligence purposes. I hadn't stumbled into a misunderstanding or case of mistaken identity. I'd walked directly into a carefully orchestrated trap that had been set for people exactly like me. The realization made me feel violated and foolish for not recognizing the signs earlier. They've been building profiles on American energy sector personnel for years, Galina explained, pointing to files containing detailed information about executives from major oil and gas companies across the United States. Personal histories, family backgrounds, financial situations, technical specializations. They identify potential assets who might be blackmailed or coerced into providing ongoing intelligence through various forms of leverage. Those who resist disappear into the Russian legal system on fabricated espionage charges. She showed me newspaper clippings about American businessmen who'd been arrested in Moscow on various charges, their cases dragging through Russian courts for months before quiet diplomatic resolutions. Some had been held for years before being released, their careers destroyed and their lives permanently altered by the experience of detention and interrogation. The scope of the operation was staggering as I absorbed all the information she was sharing with me. Dozens of American companies had unknowingly sent personnel into this intelligence collection system, believing they were pursuing legitimate business opportunities in the Russian energy sector. The Russians had been patient and methodical, building relationships over years, gathering information piece by piece, compromising individuals through a combination of honey traps, financial inducements, and legal threats. Those who proved useful were cultivated as long-term assets, providing intelligence for years without realizing they were compromised. Those who proved resistant simply disappeared into the legal system, becoming examples that discouraged others from resisting. The operation was brilliant in its design and terrifying in its effectiveness. Galina handed me a secure phone and explained the extraction plan that had been prepared for situations exactly like mine. Embassy security personnel were positioned at multiple locations around the hotel, ready to escort me to safety once I could exit the building without triggering immediate pursuit. But the extraction had to happen tonight, before Petrov's search operation commenced in the early morning hours. Once the Russians realized I was missing, they would lock down the hotel and surrounding areas, making escape exponentially more difficult. We had perhaps an hour before the window of opportunity closed forever, she explained. After that, I would be trapped in Moscow with no way to reach safety before they found me. The timeline was impossibly tight, but it was all we had. The plan required precise timing and flawless execution, with no margin for error or deviation from the schedule. I would return to my room and maintain normal appearance until exactly midnight, when the hotel's security shift change created a brief gap in surveillance coverage. During that 15-minute window, I would exit through the service corridors that Katya controlled, meeting extraction personnel in the hotel's loading dock area. From there, embassy vehicles would transport me to diplomatic facilities where Russian authorities couldn't pursue without creating an international incident. It sounded simple in theory, but I knew that any number of things could go wrong. A delayed shift change, an unexpected patrol, a maintenance worker in the wrong place at the wrong time. Any of these could expose me and end the extraction attempt before it began. But as I prepared to leave Galina's suite and return to my room to wait for midnight, she grabbed my arm with urgent force that stopped me in my tracks. "There's something else you need to understand," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening to our conversation. "This operation isn't just about intelligence collection on individual businessmen. The Russians are preparing something much larger, something that requires detailed knowledge of American energy infrastructure vulnerabilities. Every piece of information they've gathered from conferences like this is building toward a comprehensive attack capability against U.S. energy systems. The implications of what she was saying took a moment to fully register, but when they did, I felt a new kind of fear that had nothing to do with my personal safety. The implications were terrifying as I considered what this meant for national security. If Russian intelligence services were mapping American pipeline networks, distribution systems, and control mechanisms, they were potentially preparing for cyber attacks or physical sabotage operations that could cripple U.S. energy infrastructure during a crisis or conflict. The technical questions I'd been asking about Siberian pipeline routes weren't just triggering suspicions about espionage. They were interfering with a strategic intelligence operation designed to gather attack capabilities against my own country's critical infrastructure. My innocent due diligence had accidentally stumbled into something far larger than corporate espionage. The Russians were preparing for potential warfare against American energy systems, and every conference attendee was an unwitting source of intelligence for that preparation. I returned to my room with a completely transformed understanding of my situation and what was really at stake. The conference materials scattered across my desk weren't innocent business documents. They were potential intelligence products that Russian operatives intended to analyze for strategic vulnerabilities. My laptop contained not just technical specifications, but also contact information for dozens of American energy sector personnel who could become targets for future recruitment or attack operations. Every conversation I'd had, every question I'd asked, every contact I'd made had been recorded and analyzed by hostile intelligence services. I felt sick thinking about how my professional networking had potentially exposed colleagues to danger, how my questions about infrastructure had provided information that could be used against my country. The waiting was excruciating as the minutes crawled toward midnight. I sat in the darkened room watching the digital clock advance, knowing that Russian security personnel might arrive at any moment to begin their search operation. Every sound in the hallway made my heart race with adrenaline. Every elevator ding suggested approaching danger and the possibility that they were coming early. I had to maintain the appearance of a sleeping conference attendee while remaining ready to move instantly when the extraction window opened. The contradiction between seeming normal and preparing for escape created a psychological tension that stretched my nerves to the breaking point. I couldn't allow myself to relax or become complacent, but I also couldn't appear tense or alert if anyone happened to check on me before the planned time. At 11:47 p.m., my secure phone buzzed with a message from Galina that made my pulse quicken. Shift change confirmed. Katya in position. Move in 8 minutes exactly. I gathered my essential items and prepared for what might be the most dangerous 15 minutes of my life. If the timing was wrong, if the security gap didn't materialize as expected, if any component of the plan failed, I would find myself trapped in a hostile foreign country with no legal protection and no diplomatic recourse. The Russians could hold me indefinitely on espionage charges, and my government would have limited options for securing my release. I'd become another newspaper story about an American businessman detained in Russia, my fate dependent on negotiations that could take months or years. At precisely midnight, I opened my door and moved toward the service elevator with as much calm as I could project. The hallways were eerily quiet, with only emergency lighting providing dim illumination that cast strange shadows on the walls. Katya appeared beside her cart as if she'd been waiting there all evening, her presence both reassuring and terrifying. She led me through corridors I'd never seen, past storage rooms and mechanical spaces that formed the hidden infrastructure of the luxury hotel. Every step took me deeper into areas where surveillance cameras couldn't track movement, where my disappearance might go unnoticed for precious additional minutes. We moved quickly but quietly, our footsteps barely audible on the concrete floors. The service areas of the hotel were a different world from the elegant public spaces, utilitarian and stark. The service elevator descended to a basement level that smelled of laundry chemicals and industrial cleaning supplies, familiar scents that seemed surreal in this dangerous situation. Katya guided me through a maze of storage areas toward what I hoped was the loading dock where extraction personnel waited. But as we approached the final corridor, she suddenly stopped and pressed her finger to her lips, signaling absolute silence. Voices echoed from ahead, speaking in Russian with tones that suggested official authority and systematic searching. The extraction point had been compromised, and there were people between us and safety. My heart sank as I realized the careful plan was falling apart. We stood frozen in the dim corridor, barely breathing as we tried to assess the situation and figure out what to do next. Katya grabbed my arm and pulled me into a storage room filled with folded linens and cleaning equipment, the door closing silently behind us. Through the thin walls, I could hear Russian security personnel questioning hotel staff about my whereabouts, their voices growing more agitated and urgent. They'd discovered my absence sooner than expected and were systematically searching the building, checking every possible exit point. The extraction plan had failed, leaving me trapped in the basement of a Moscow hotel with hostile intelligence operatives hunting for me throughout the building. Katya's frightened expression told me everything I needed to know about our chances of escape through the planned route. We would have to improvise something else, find another way out, or hide until they gave up the search. She pressed another note into my hands, this one written in Russian characters that I couldn't read despite the warning she'd given me. but she whispered a translation that made my blood freeze in my veins. They know about Galena. Embassy contact compromised. FSB controlling extraction. You're walking into trap. The realization that Russian intelligence had been monitoring our escape plan from the beginning sent waves of panic through my chest. Everything we'd planned, every contact we'd trusted, every route we'd considered had been known to the enemy from the start. They'd been watching us plan my escape, probably laughing at our efforts. The extraction team waiting at the loading dock was probably Russian security personnel ready to arrest me the moment I appeared. The voices grew closer, and I could hear search teams systematically checking storage rooms throughout the basement level, their progress methodical and thorough. We had perhaps minutes before they reached our hiding place and discovered us. Katya gestured toward a maintenance shaft that led to the hotel's mechanical systems, indicating it was my only remaining escape route. But the shaft was narrow, dark, and led to an uncertain destination somewhere in the building's infrastructure. I would be crawling blindly through ventilation systems while armed security personnel searched every accessible area of the hotel. It was desperate and dangerous, but it was the only option left. I looked at the narrow opening and wondered if I'd be able to fit through it. As I prepared to enter the maintenance shaft, Katya pressed a final item into my hands, a small electronic device that she identified as a GPS beacon linked to genuine American intelligence services, not the compromised embassy contacts that had been feeding information to Russian operatives. If I could reach the roof or an exterior wall of the building, the beacon would signal my location to extraction teams that Russian intelligence couldn't monitor or intercept. It was a desperate plan with minimal chance of success, but it represented my only remaining hope for escape. The device was small and surprisingly light, but it felt like it carried the weight of my entire future. I nodded my thanks to Katya, unable to find words adequate for what she was risking to help me. The maintenance shaft was a claustrophobic nightmare of metal ducts and electrical conduits that scraped against my back as I crawled through the darkness on my hands and knees. Behind me, I could hear Russian voices discovering our abandoned storage room, their anger evident even through the language barrier and the muffling effect of the metal walls around me. They knew I was somewhere in the building's infrastructure, and they would systematically search every possible hiding place until they found me. The GPS beacon in my pocket felt like both salvation and burden, representing my only connection to friendly forces in a hostile environment. I tried not to think about what would happen if I got stuck in these narrow passages, if the shaft ended at a dead end with no way forward or back. After what felt like hours of crawling through the building's mechanical systems, though it was probably only 20 minutes, I found a vertical shaft that led upward toward higher floors. The climb was treacherous, with only maintenance ladder rungs providing handholds in the complete darkness where I couldn't see what I was grabbing. But each floor I climbed took me further from the basement search operation and closer to potential external communication points, where the GPS beacon might function properly. My hands were scraped and bleeding from the rough metal surfaces, and my knees ached from the crawling, but adrenaline kept me moving upward through the hotel's hidden infrastructure. I tried not to look down into the darkness below, focusing only on the next rung, the next movement upward toward safety. I emerged from the shaft system onto the hotel's roof, where Moscow's cold night air hit my face like a physical shock after the stale atmosphere of the maintenance systems. The city spread out below me, with the Kremlin's illuminated towers providing a surreal backdrop to my desperate escape attempt. I activated the GPS beacon and prayed that genuine American intelligence operatives were monitoring the signal, ready to execute a real extraction operation that Russian services couldn't anticipate or prevent. The device's tiny LED blinked red, indicating it was transmitting my location to unknown recipients somewhere in the darkness. I had no way of knowing if anyone was receiving the signal, if help was coming, or if I was just exposing my position to more danger. Within minutes, I heard helicopters approaching from the west, their sound growing louder as they crossed Moscow's skyline toward the hotel where I stood exposed. But I also heard Russian voices in the stairwell below, indicating that security personnel had traced my route through the maintenance systems and were climbing toward the roof. The extraction was going to be a race between American rescue teams and Russian capture operations, with my freedom hanging in the balance. I crouched behind air conditioning equipment and waited for whatever happened next, my entire body tense with anticipation. The helicopters were getting closer, but so were the footsteps on the stairs. It was going to be very close, and I had no idea which side would reach me first. The helicopter that landed on the hotel's roof bore no national markings, but the personnel who jumped out wore equipment and moved with professionalism that suggested American Special Operations Forces responding to the beacon. They secured the landing area with military precision while one operative approached my position and identified himself using code words that Galena had provided earlier. But as we prepared to board the helicopter, Russian security personnel burst through the roof access door, weapons drawn and shouting commands in multiple languages. The confrontation happened so fast that I barely had time to process what was occurring. Both sides had weapons trained on each other, and I was caught in the middle of what could turn into an international incident. The confrontation lasted perhaps 30 seconds, though it felt much longer. with both sides recognizing that shooting would create an international incident with unpredictable consequences. The Americans held superior tactical position and advanced equipment, while the Russians had legal authority within their own territory and superior numbers. Finally, the senior Russian operative approached the helicopter and engaged in rapid negotiations with the American team leader. Their conversation conducted in accented English that both sides could understand. I couldn't hear everything they were saying over the helicopter noise, but I could see them gesturing and arguing, each trying to find a solution that didn't involve violence. The tension was unbearable, as I stood there wondering if this would end in gunfire or diplomacy. The resolution was elegant in its simplicity, a compromise that allowed both sides to save face. The Americans would be permitted to leave with their extracted asset, but Russian authorities would announce that they had successfully concluded their investigation and determined that no espionage activities had occurred. Both governments would benefit from avoiding the international crisis that would result from either my capture or a shootout on a Moscow hotel roof. The face-saving compromise allowed everyone to claim victory while preventing a diplomatic disaster. I would be free, and the Russians could say they'd investigated and cleared me. It was the best outcome anyone could have hoped for given the circumstances, though I knew the truth was far more complicated than the official story would suggest. As the helicopter lifted off from the metropole Moscow, I looked down at the city where I'd nearly disappeared into the Russian intelligence system forever. Katya was somewhere in that maze of lights, probably facing interrogation about her role in my escape, but protected by her value as a long-term intelligence asset. Galina was likely being reassigned to a different posting, her cover blown, but her diplomatic immunity protecting her from serious consequences. Both women had risked everything to save an American businessman they'd never met before that night, acting on principle and courage rather than personal connection. I owed them my freedom and possibly my life, and I had no way to thank them or repay that debt. The helicopter banked west toward international airspace, and Moscow disappeared behind us. If this one kept you hooked, the next ones will too. Make sure to subscribe, leave a comment, and stay tuned for more.